Hey folks, Mike Seeklander here. Welcome to the NRA Show. Beautiful sunny day, I think, outside. We're not sure we're inside. I'm here at the Team Armscor booth where Rock Island Armory and Armscor is, and we're going to be talking to you real quickly about some quick tips. And mainly today I'm going to focus on the draw process because, of course, you know, if you're a three-gunner or a competitive shooter in any kind of handgun discipline, the draw process is going to be a key to your success. I'm going to be demoing from my USPSA single stack gear, and the reason I'm wearing this gear is because here in, I guess, about a month or so, the single stack nationals is coming up, so this is typically what I'm going to be training with prior to the match itself. So, of course, before we begin, got an unloaded firearm. All the firearms here at the NRA Show or the SHOT Show or whatever else are always declared unloaded. They're safe firearms, but when we start the process itself and actually talk to you about the technique, I'm going to be drawn at a slightly different angle just because if you've never been to a show like this, it's really awesome, it's really exciting, but there are literally hundreds of people around the booth, so it's very, very difficult for me to have a safe aiming point for the firearm. And of course, if I were teaching you a class, if I were at your range somewhere, I'd be very deliberate to not expose that muzzle towards you or point the muzzle in your direction. In this environment, it's very difficult to control. So, quick tips on the draw process. Number one, if you're going to draw your handgun at any stage, you want to set yourself up for success. When I'm talking about success, oftentimes when we have an array of targets, you know, in the first position when you're about to shoot, out of the shooting box itself, those targets and the target or the course designer oftentimes put targets at different angles. So I may have a start position where my feet are in one place, but I'm going to have to engage a target to my right or a target to my left, and lots of times in most stages, we're going to have to shoot 2 or 3 targets, and then we're going to have to move. So, mentally, if I'm simply focused on the draw process and I'm not thinking about the other things that are about to happen, I'm going to lose time. And I like to tell my students, it's not necessarily about trying to go fast, but not wasting time. So, when I'm getting ready to do the draw process, I want to set myself up for success. Well, what do I mean by that? Shooting position, number one, is critically important. And when I'm talking about shooting position, I start from the feet. And literally, and you can measure this the next time you go to the range, if my feet are in a good position for a nice, low, aggressive stance, and I'll give you an example. If my feet are inside my shoulders, and I try to do a transition to different targets with the firearm, and I measure that transition is going to be slower than if I have my feet slightly outside of my shoulders. The second part of that equation is my body weight needs to be on the balls of my feet. And if you can think about, a good analogy is grip the ground with your toes. And if you grip the ground with your toes, that's automatically going to shift the body weight forward, and that's where we want the body weight. We don't want the body weight back on our heels. Because remember, anytime you're going to move, and the draw process is often associated with movement, we need to transfer that weight forward to the balls of the feet and then push off the balls of the feet. If my body weight is back on the heels, in order to move, what do I have to do? You guessed it, I've got to shift my body weight forward and then move, and that wastes time. We're trying to prevent wasting time, okay? So, from this position, nice wide stance, my feet are going to be wider than shoulder width or outside of the lines of my shoulder. That's setting myself up for success. The second thing I want to do is if I know I'm going to have to move somewhere, and I know to move I have to bend my knees, I'm probably better off starting with my knees bent, right? Makes sense to have my knees bent so I'm ready to explode to the next position versus having my legs locked. Number 3, on the way up, of course, I want to have a nice neutral position where my gun angle and cant is set up properly. So literally, when I put my hand on my gun, it instinctively goes to the grip. And if you notice my holster position in this Safari Land holster, my holster cant, and this is for a USPSA style, of course, is about 1 degree forward a position, 1 degree forward. And the reason for that is this allows me to put my hand naturally on the gun and keep my wrist at a natural angle. If my gun were canted back 1 or 2 or 3 degrees, for example, then when I put my hand on my gun, I'm going to have to break my shoulder. And that's excessive movement. And what does excessive movement do? You guessed it, it wastes time. We want to think about not wasting time. Okay. So let's break down the draw process once we have our stance into some basic steps and principles. Principle number one, when one hand moves, both hands move. And that simply means that if I'm starting with my hands relaxed at sides, when one hand moves, both hands move. If the course designer has me place my hands on a wall or holding an obstacle, and oftentimes we'll start by having to hold something in the course of fire, when one hand moves to the gun, both hands move. Now, this movement to the gun is a key position. So when one hand moves, both hands move. The second rule there is when one hand moves at a certain speed, they both move at that speed. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I were doing a standing draw with my hands relaxed at sides, when I draw the handgun, if my strong hand or my gun hand gets to the gun first and my left hand or my support hand trails, I'm always going to be chasing that hand to build the grip. And the last thing that I want to do is I want to chase a strong hand. I want these hands, when I build the grip, to go together at the same time so I can begin to refine my grip here as I extend the gun and be ready to shoot. So we don't want to be moving the hands at different speeds. So remember, I'll test you here later on, when one hand moves, both hands move. Number two, when one hand moves at a certain speed, both hands have to move at that certain speed, okay? So here's the question, where do the hands go? And this is a key point. Now, strong hand. I'm going to turn this direction so you can focus a little bit more on the position of the gun itself. The strong hand is going to index the gun by coming slightly behind it. So if the gun is seated in the holster like this, when I draw, my hand is actually to come slightly behind the gun, index the back strap of the grip itself, and slide aggressively up to a nice firm grip. And the reason I do that is, if I come slightly behind the gun and index up the grip itself, that builds a consistent stopping point each and every time. If I come straight down on top of the gun, sometimes I may hit the beaver tail, sometimes I may get a low grip. It's going to be inconsistent in where my hand goes on the gun itself. So once again, when that strong hand indexes the gun itself, it's going to come slightly behind the gun and slide up. And I'll tell you where I got that from. That came from Team Armscor teammate Eric Raffel, multiple-time world champion, a guy that certainly knows what he's talking about. So pay attention to that tip. So strong hand goes behind the gun. Now when I grab the gun, there's a couple key things that are happening. When I'm actually gripping the handgun, I'm aggressively gripping it. So I'm not just setting my hand there. I'm not just hoping it goes to the right spot. I'm aggressively gripping the handgun, okay? Got the strong hand down. So what does the support hand do? Remember, both hands are moving at the same time and the same speed. So when I'm gripping the handgun like this, the support hand needs to be placed in a spot somewhere in the center of my body that sets it up for success. And well, what do I mean by set it up for success? That means that if it's in the right position, when I pull my hand out of the, or pull my gun out of the holster, the second the gun drives by that support hand, if the support hand is in the right spot, then I can very easy and quickly get the second hand on the handgun. If it's in the wrong spot, for example, if it's too high on my chest and the handgun comes out of the holster, what do I have to do to the support hand? You're right, I have to bring it down. What does that cost me? Time. So once again, we're talking about time. Time is the key factor. If the support hand is too low, when the gun comes out of the holster, what do I have to do? I have to bring it up. Once again, that costs me time. So my support hand position is going to be a spot where basically once the gun starts to come out of the holster, the support hand is basically even with the trigger guard. And that's going to be my index point with the support hand. Now, step one of the draw process, step two of the draw process. Let's break those down. Step one meets the principles we just talked about. Step two, we're going to do some other things, and I'm going to talk to you about step two from a different angle, once again for safety reasons because of where we are. So when we're talking about step one of the draw process, you can practice this very simply by simply moving both hands at the same time, the same speed, and practicing your grip of the handgun. Now notice when I'm moving my hands, the grip itself, nothing else is moving. For example, I'm not hunching down, I'm not bending my knees, I'm not picking my shoulders up, I'm not leaning, I'm not doing all that stuff. Those are all wasted motions. And as I've said like 55 times now, what are wasted motions? They're wastes of time. So when I practice it, I'm simply going to start nice and slow. And I'll tell you, when I have a group of students in class and we start out dry fire, we will always start at a dry fire pace that is about 50% speed. And the reason for that is if we're training at 50% speed, it truly gives you the time to slow down and ingrain the technique correctly. And anytime we're training, anytime you're practicing a skill, we're going through a process called myelination, which means we're ingraining that skill. And if you ingrain it wrong, guess what? When you go to a match, you're going to get wrong. So for those of you watching this, you're probably wondering, well, Mike, you said go to a match. Well, how does this technique work from a defensive context? Don't worry about that. We're going to talk about that in a future video film tomorrow. We'll talk about the defensive draw because it's a completely different thought process when we're talking about the technique. So, step one of the draw process. moving the hands to the gun. And what I oftentimes do once I start to get this technique down, now I'll start varying the hand start position. So for example, instead of just hands relaxed at sides, I'm going to start working my surrender position draw process. I may simulate that my hands are on a barricade and I'm bringing the hands to the gun, hands on my knees, hands holding an obstacle. And notice every time I do this, the hands are doing the same thing. The strong hand is indexing behind the gun and the support hand is going to the spot every single time to set me up for success, okay? Step one of the draw process is basically getting ourselves ready to pull the gun out. Step two of the draw process entails some other processes where we're going to be building our grip, prepping the trigger, seeing the sights, and putting it all together for that perfect shot on the first target on stage. Let us change some angles up. Let me show you step two. Okay, so we talked about step one of the draw process and the principles. Remember, when one hand moves, both hands move. And when one hand moves at a certain speed, both hands move at a certain speed. And we talked about your index points with both hands. So now I want to show you step two of the draw process. And this is going to require that I change my angles just a little bit for safety. But there are a lot of things going on in step two of the draw process. We're going to start, though, from step one. So, as you know, step one of the draw process, we built the perfect grip on the handgun, driven that hand nice and high and aggressively, and the second hand is set up for success. And what I meant by that was the second hand is in a position where literally when the holster lets go of the gun and the gun becomes free to drive straight to the target, as soon as that gun drives by my support hand, this allows me to index, and I call this the Judy chop, and I can expand on that more in some YouTube videos. When I'm talking about index points allow me to build my grip consistently. And when you're shooting, one of the most important things you could do is figure out how to train technique that is consistent, because consistency allows you to push your pace and it allows you to apply those techniques in the match environment. And if you think about it, we're not practicing to do well in the practice environment where there's no pressure. We're practicing to do well in the match environment where there's lots of pressure. So consistency is the key. So gun comes out of the holster, drives by the support hand. At this point in time, I'm going to chop up into the index of the trigger guard. That's why I call it the Judy chop. Now notice, if I take my support hand, my four fingers are together, and I index and hit the corner of where the trigger guard is and my fingers are, this is a consistent stopping point for my left hand. If I just put the hands together somewhere in free space, then I'm going to have an inconsistent draw because the hands are going to go different places on the gun, and I don't want that. So if I Judy chop or index below the trigger guard here, this keeps me consistent. Now I'll give you another secret, a little tip for you, beyond the draw. This Judy chop position is something I may use, for example, when I open a door and rebuild the grip. If I have to manipulate something and rebuild the grip, when I run and rebuild the grip, this same index point is going to keep me consistent on my grip. Okay, so gun drove by, support hand Judy chops onto the grip itself. And now another key facet of the draw, and this is one of those secrets that I'm going to tell you in this video, but nobody else watching, because it's our secret. My strong hand thumb is actually flagged. If you notice, the thumb is flagged up in the air, if you can see that. The reason for that is I want all of this grip panel exposed. I want as much grip as possible for my support hand when I get it on the gun. So, strong hand thumb is flagged, did my Judy chop, and now my left palm starts laying down in the grip. And about this point, I'm probably halfway through my draw process. Both hands are on the gun. I've fully built my grip, and at that point in time, with this NRA 1911, I'm going to wipe the safety off. Notice my safety did not come off before that. I want to make sure to build the grip and then wipe the safety off. And from here to the final extension point of the draw process, imagine my grip pressure being set up on a little dial. And as I extend the gun, that pressure is going up, 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 up until here, if you can look at my forearms, now I'm exerting maximum grip pressure on the gun. One of the things I like to give my students is, with my strong hand I'm gripping hard, with my support hand I'm gripping harder. When I get to final extension, of course, I've done another thing along the way, and that is take the slack out of the trigger. Because at this point in time, the gun is truly pointed at the target. I'm probably somewhere near the aiming zone, and if I can take that little bit of slack out of the trigger by the time the gun stops, all I've got to do is verify precise sight alignment and fire the shot. So in other words, when I get the gun stopped, I don't have to stop the gun, then go through all the trigger work and then fire the shot. I'm doing those things at the same time. So Judy chop, build the grip, extend the gun, grip pressure is increasing, prep the trigger, take the slack out, and if I see what I need to see on the sights, I'm going to fire the shot, okay? So, step 1 of the draw process, index points, build my grip. Step 2 of the draw process, drive by, fire my shot. And when you practice this, of course, work on the steps initially when you're firing your shots, but once you feel like you're confident in those steps, we want to put it all together and we want to smooth it out. So in other words, I see a lot of shooters on the range that do a draw process in a step-by-step jerky motion. Once you've learned the steps, never go back to the step-by-step process unless you're trying to teach yourself something. So when I actually practice the full draw, I'm going to practice it very deliberately, but remember that little speed dial. I'm going to turn that speed dial down to 50%, so I'm really truly experiencing the draw process and working on the technique that I'm trying to build. So that might be 50% of my speed, and as I'm comfortable with that, I'm going to start picking up the pace to 60% or 70%, for example, or 80%, and every single time I'm seeing a good sight picture, I'm seeing what I need to see. Notice how there's no additional movement. I'm looking for a wasted motion, picking up the pace as fast as I can move the gun until I'm up in the 95% range. And what I'm looking for here is my failure point. So let me define failure point. Your failure point is where you're pushing a pace and that pace is beyond your ability, meaning you know, hey, I just drew the gun out and I dry fired a shot, or if you're doing live fire, I live fired a shot and the sights were not corrected. I didn't have time to fix the sights. Or maybe when you fired the shot, you did something on the trigger and you moved the gun and you saw some movement in the sight. That's your failure point. And when you're practicing, once you reach your failure point, then we want to take that speed dial, back it down a few notches, fix whatever that thing was in your failure point, try to get that fixed, get that technique corrected, and then guess what? I'm going to start cranking the speed up. So I'm always balancing pushing my speed and technique perfectly and watching for that failure point, and every time I hit that failure point, you got it. I'm fixing whatever I did wrong. Now along the way, in this 20-minute video, give or take, I probably talked about 50 or 60 things or 50 or 60 key points. And every once in a while, we have a guy looking at a gun that steps into the video, but that's okay because we are at the NRA show. And the key here is when you're looking at these techniques, how do you like that gun? That's the new Rock Island Armory 380, by the way. When you find a technique failure point, don't forget in your dry fire and live fire drills to correct those failure points and make sure you fix them. Hey, sir, have a nice day. And fix those failure points. And that was the full draw process. Remember, the steps are only necessary to learn the key points. Once you got the steps down, practice the smooth, consistent draw process. Start out at 50%, crank the speed till you hit your failure point, correct your failure points, and then continually push, 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 push. So that was the competitive draw process. Once again, brought to you from the NRA show here at the Rock Island Armory Armscor booth. Until then, train hard.